A billionaire CEO discovers his trusted tutor has been deliberately poisoning his blind son for over a year. As federal investigators descend on his pharmaceutical empire, shocking evidence reveals the poison originated from inside his own company, sold by someone on his personal staff. The truth threatens everything he's built. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. Marcus Ashford was 53 years old and owned everything except the one thing that mattered most: his son. At the top of a glass tower in Manhattan, surrounded by screens displaying stock prices and market reports, he felt nothing. His office occupied the entire 42nd floor. Floor-to-ceiling windows showed the city sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered but couldn't enjoy. He had built Ashford Pharmaceuticals from nothing, turning himself into one of the most powerful men in America. But power didn't help him now. His 11-year-old son David was blind. Born blind. The doctors had said it was a rare genetic condition, something that couldn't be fixed. Marcus had paid the best specialists, traveled to Switzerland and Singapore, spent millions searching for answers. Nothing worked. Then 6 months ago, something worse happened. David started losing his hearing too. Not all at once, but gradually. Sounds became muffled. Words grew harder to understand. The doctors had no explanation. They ran tests, looked at his ears, his brain, checked for infections. Everything came back normal, which made no sense. How could a child be losing his hearing when there was nothing medically wrong with him? Marcus sat in his office at midnight, staring at the city lights. His hands were clenched on the desk. His son was locked in darkness, and now he was being locked in silence too. And Marcus couldn't stop it. He had faced hostile takeovers, FDA investigations, rival CEOs trying to destroy him. He had won every battle. But this was different. This wasn't a battle he could win with money or lawyers or threats. This was his son's body betraying him, and Marcus was powerless to stop it. David lived with Marcus in a penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park. The space was enormous, decorated by an interior designer who had never met either of them. Everything was modern and cold. There was a room specifically designed for David with soft lighting, no hard edges, sensory toys, and books printed in Braille. Marcus had spared no expense. The specialists had all said David needed routine, calm environments, and consistency. Marcus hired staff to maintain that routine. A chef who prepared exactly the same meals at exactly the same times. A cleaner who organized everything so David could navigate without assistance. A tutor who came 3 times a week to work on academics. A physical therapist who helped David move through the world without falling. None of them stayed long. They found it difficult, emotionally draining, depressing. Marcus didn't care about their feelings. He paid them generously and expected them to do their jobs. His latest hire was named Simone. She was the housekeeper, responsible for cleaning, laundry, and basic household management. She was black, in her early 30s, with a quiet way of moving through the apartment as if she didn't want to disturb anything. Marcus barely noticed her when she started. He was too focused on David's declining hearing to pay attention to staff. But Simone was different from the others. She didn't leave after 2 weeks. She didn't complain about the emotional toll. She simply showed up every day and did her work with a kind of peaceful dedication that seemed almost impossible given the circumstances. Marcus had no idea that Simone had a daughter of her own, a 5-year-old girl with cerebral palsy who couldn't walk. She understood loss and disability in a way that went deeper than most people. She didn't see David as a problem to be managed. She saw him as a child who deserved care, not charity. The first time Simone noticed something was wrong, she was cleaning David's room. It was early morning before Marcus had gone to work. She was dusting the bookshelves, moving his Braille books carefully when she found something wedged behind the radiator. A small glass bottle. She pulled it out and examined the label. It was written in medical terms she didn't fully understand, but one word stood out. Poison. Her hand started to shake. She looked at the bottle again, trying to make sure she wasn't misreading. But the label was clear. There were warning symbols, text about toxicity, instructions about disposal. It was definitely poison. Simone's heart raced. She looked around the room as if the answer might be written on the walls. Why would there be poison hidden in David's room? Who had put it there? Her mind jumped to the worst conclusion. Was someone trying to hurt the boy? She carefully placed the bottle back where she found it, not wanting to disturb anything or leave evidence that she had seen it. Her hands were shaking as she finished cleaning. She needed to think. She needed to understand what this meant before she said anything to anyone. Over the next few days, Simone kept the discovery to herself. It gnawed at her constantly. She couldn't stop thinking about David, about his failing hearing, about the poison hidden behind the radiator. She began paying closer attention to his behavior, his patterns, his daily routine. She noticed that David seemed to get worse on certain days, that his hearing loss seemed to progress faster at times. She also noticed that the previous housekeepers had lasted only a couple of weeks before leaving. Was that a coincidence? She started asking herself dangerous questions. What if someone was deliberately poisoning David? What if his hearing loss wasn't a medical mystery at all? What if it was intentional? Simone knew she could be fired for snooping, for overstepping her role as a housekeeper. But she also knew she couldn't ignore what she'd found. She needed more information. She needed to understand what that poison was, and how it might be affecting David. One afternoon, while Marcus was at work, and David was with his tutor, Simone carefully retrieved the bottle from behind the radiator. She used her phone to take pictures of the label, making sure to capture every word. Then she looked up the substance online. What she found made her blood run cold. The poison was a slow-acting compound used in some pharmaceutical applications, but it had severe neurological side effects. Prolonged exposure, especially in children, could cause hearing loss, vision problems, coordination issues, and cognitive decline. Exactly what was happening to David. Simone felt sick. She was looking at evidence of someone deliberately harming a child. But she still didn't know who. She didn't know why. She didn't know how the poison was getting into David's system. Was it in his food, in the air he breathed, on surfaces he touched? The possibilities were endless and terrifying. She needed to tell someone. But who would believe her? She was just the housekeeper. She had no medical training. All she had was a bottle and a terrible suspicion. She thought about going to Marcus, but something held her back. What if Marcus already knew? What if he was involved? She knew it sounded paranoid, but she had learned the hard way that wealthy people sometimes did terrible things to protect their money and power. Instead, Simone decided to do her own investigation. She needed evidence. Real, undeniable evidence that would prove someone was poisoning David. She began carefully documenting everything. When David seemed to have a bad day, she noted it. When his hearing seemed worse, she recorded it. She started taking inventory of what was in the apartment, looking for other bottles, other suspicious items. She watched the other staff members, trying to figure out if any of them might be responsible. The chef seemed kind. The tutor was professional. The physical therapist was compassionate. None of them seemed like they would hurt David. But Simone knew that appearances could be deceiving. She also began researching the poison more thoroughly. She learned that it could be ingested, inhaled, or absorbed through skin. The symptoms progressed slowly, which meant David might have been exposed for weeks or months before anyone noticed the hearing loss. The more Simone learned, the more frightened she became, and the more convinced she was that if she didn't do something, David's condition would get progressively worse, until he couldn't see or hear or think clearly anymore. She thought about her own daughter, about how she would feel if someone was hurting her child. She thought about the look in David's eyes when he tried to listen to things but couldn't quite hear them. The frustration, the fear, the loneliness of being trapped in darkness and silence. Simone made a decision. She would find proof. She would understand what was happening to David, and then she would make sure whoever was responsible paid for it. It took Simone 2 weeks of careful observation before she noticed the pattern. The tutor, a woman named Victoria who came 3 times a week, always wore gloves when she was in the apartment. She said it was because she had sensitive skin, but Simone began to wonder if there was another reason. Victoria handled David's food sometimes, his books, his belongings. What if the poison was on her gloves? What if she was the one deliberately exposing him? Simone watched Victoria more closely during her tutoring sessions. She noticed that Victoria spent a lot of time with David, sometimes longer than scheduled. She noticed that Victoria was always alone with him, and she would close the door to his room. She noticed that, after Victoria left, David would often seem more tired, more withdrawn, his hearing seemingly worse. One day, while Victoria was tutoring David, Simone went through Victoria's bag. She knew she was overstepping every boundary, violating privacy and trust, but she was desperate. At the bottom of the bag, under papers and notebooks, Simone found another bottle, identical to the one hidden behind David's radiator. Her hands trembled. She took pictures of it, careful not to disturb anything else. Then she put everything back exactly as she had found it. Simone's mind raced. Victoria was poisoning David. But why? What was her motivation? Simone did more research and made a disturbing connection. Victoria was the daughter of a rival CEO, a man who had been in a bitter lawsuit with Marcus years ago. The lawsuit had destroyed the man's company and his reputation. He had died by suicide shortly after the court ruling. Victoria was getting revenge. She was hurting Marcus's son to punish him for destroying her father. The pieces fit perfectly, and the realization made Simone feel faint with horror. She had to tell Marcus. She had to tell him immediately. But she also knew that Victoria would deny everything. She would claim the bottle wasn't hers. She would say Simone was lying, or confused. She would probably destroy the evidence. Simone needed to do this carefully. She needed to gather more proof. She needed to make sure that when she went to Marcus, she had undeniable evidence that would force him to believe her and take action. Over the next few days, Simone set up her phone to record audio during Victoria's tutoring sessions. She placed the phone under a table in David's room where it wouldn't be easily found. She recorded 3 sessions, listening to them later with growing horror. In the recordings, Victoria would sometimes tell David strange things. She would whisper to him that he was getting worse, that he would never be able to see or hear properly again, that his father didn't really care about him. She was psychologically tormenting him while simultaneously poisoning him. It was evil. Absolute evil. Simone had all the evidence she needed. Bottles with Victoria's fingerprints on them, audio recordings of her whispering psychological abuse, the pattern of David's deterioration matching Victoria's visits. Simone knew she had to act fast. If she waited too long, Victoria might realize she was being observed and destroy the evidence. Or worse, she might poison David with a larger dose and seriously harm him. Simone made copies of the audio files and saved them to cloud storage in case anything happened to her phone. She carefully photographed the bottles again. She documented everything in a detailed written account, including dates, times, and observations. Then she requested a meeting with Marcus. She told his assistant it was urgent and personal. Marcus was surprised when Simone asked to speak with him. He had barely spoken to her since hiring her. She was just part of the household machinery, someone who kept things running smoothly. He was in the middle of a conference call when she approached him, and he almost dismissed her, but something in her expression made him pause. He could see that she was genuinely frightened. He ended the call and asked her to sit down. Simone had rehearsed what she would say, but the words still came out in a rush. She told him about the poison bottle. She told him about Victoria's pattern of visits. She told him about the audio recordings. She showed him the pictures on her phone. She laid out her entire investigation in clear, logical progression. Marcus listened without interrupting. His face remained impassive as Simone spoke, but his hands were clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. When she finished, there was silence. Marcus stared at her for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether she was telling the truth or if she had somehow become mentally unstable. Then he stood up and walked to his bedroom. He came back with a small digital device and asked Simone to play the audio recordings. As Victoria's voice filled the room, whispering cruel things to David, Marcus's face changed. His expression went from skepticism to something darker. Rage, absolute fury, but also something else. Guilt. He had hired Victoria without doing a thorough background check. He had been so focused on his work that he hadn't properly vetted the person he was putting in his son's life. And while he was building his pharmaceutical empire, someone had been systematically poisoning his child. Marcus listened to every recording. He looked at every picture. He asked Simone detailed questions about her observations and investigation. By the time she was done explaining everything, Marcus was no longer angry at her. His anger was entirely directed at Victoria and at himself. He immediately called the police and reported what Simone had discovered. He also contacted his personal attorney and informed him of the situation. Within hours, the authorities were at the apartment. Officers examined David's room and confirmed they found poison. They documented Victoria's tutoring schedule and cross-referenced it with David's hearing deterioration. They took custody of the bottles and the audio recordings as evidence. By evening, Victoria had been arrested at her apartment. Police found additional bottles of poison there, and evidence that she had been deliberately exposing David to the substance for months. The news story broke the next day. Billionaire CEO's son poisoned by tutor. Revenge plot uncovered. The media descended on the building like vultures. Cameras, reporters, questions. Marcus handled the publicity with the cold professionalism he used in business. He issued a statement thanking the authorities and the person who had discovered the plot. He didn't name Simone specifically, but it didn't matter. Everyone knew who the housekeeper was. And the question everyone was asking was the same. How did she know? What made her investigate? Why would she take such a risk? The answer was simpler than anyone realized. Simone saw David as a child who deserved protection. She had been in situations where she'd had to protect her own daughter from people who didn't care about her well-being. She recognized the signs of deliberate harm because she had seen it before. And she acted because staying silent would have been a betrayal of everything she believed in. But the real revelation came when Marcus tested David. The doctors discovered that while David's hearing had deteriorated significantly, the damage wasn't permanent. The poison had been designed to be slow-acting, to cause gradual hearing loss that seemed like a medical condition. But now that the exposure had stopped, David's hearing could potentially be restored through intensive treatment and therapy. The realization hit Marcus like a physical blow. If Simone hadn't discovered the poison when she did, David would have lost his hearing completely. He would have spent his life in total darkness and silence, unable to connect with the world in any meaningful way. All because Marcus had been too focused on his career to notice that someone was systematically harming his son. Marcus sat in David's room that night after the boy had gone to sleep. He looked at his son's face, peaceful and innocent, and felt something break inside him. He had built an empire. He had accumulated wealth beyond imagination. But he had almost lost his only child because he wasn't paying attention, because he had delegated his son's care to other people and assumed they all had good intentions, because he was too caught up in his own success to notice the darkness that had entered his son's life. The next morning, Marcus called Simone into his office. He wanted to thank her properly. He offered her a substantial financial reward. Simone refused. She said she had done what any decent person would do. She had protected a child from harm. That was enough. But Marcus insisted on doing something. He asked her what she needed. What would make her life better? After some hesitation, Simone told him. She needed help paying for her daughter's medical care. Cerebral palsy required ongoing treatment, physical therapy, specialized equipment. The costs were astronomical. She was doing everything she could, working multiple jobs, but it wasn't enough. Marcus didn't hesitate. He set up a trust fund for Simone's daughter. He paid for her medical care, her education, everything she would need. He also offered Simone a new position in his household, not as a housekeeper, but as David's full-time caregiver and companion. It would pay significantly more, and it would give her the flexibility to also care for her own daughter. Simone accepted. Over the following weeks, everything changed. David underwent intensive therapy to restore his hearing. The doctors were optimistic that most, if not all, of his hearing could be recovered. More importantly, David seemed to relax once he understood that he was going to be okay, that the mysterious deterioration was over, that he wasn't going to lose his hearing completely. Simone became David's primary companion. Unlike the previous caregivers, she didn't treat him with pity or distant professionalism. She treated him like a person. She talked to him, really talked to him, not down to him. She helped him navigate the world, but she also challenged him. She encouraged him to do things, to explore, to learn. David responded to her presence in ways that surprised everyone, including Marcus. The boy seemed to come alive. He started asking questions about the world. He started wanting to do more. He developed a sense of humor. He started being a kid again instead of just a medical problem to be managed. Marcus watched this transformation and felt something shift inside him. He realized that his mistake hadn't been just about missing the poisoning. His bigger mistake had been trying to manage David's life, to solve his problems with money and specialists and perfect environments. What David had needed was simply someone who cared about him as a person. Someone who saw beyond his blindness to the boy underneath. Someone who believed he could do more than just survive. Marcus began spending more time with David. He took time off work. He came home early. He sat with his son and listened to him talk about the world as Simone described it to him. He asked David questions about what he wanted to do, what interested him, what he dreamed about. The conversations were awkward at first. Marcus wasn't good at this. He was used to giving orders, making decisions, controlling outcomes. But gradually, he learned. He learned to listen more than he talked. He learned to let David make choices, even if those choices sometimes led to mistakes. He learned that being a father wasn't about being in control. It was about being present, about showing up, about giving a damn. One afternoon, about 3 months after Victoria's arrest, David was in his room working on something with Simone. Marcus heard them laughing together, and he stopped to listen. David was telling Simone about an idea he had. He wanted to create a podcast about what it was like to be blind, to help other kids understand that being blind didn't mean being helpless or broken. Simone was encouraging him, offering suggestions, making him feel like his idea was possible and important. Marcus felt tears forming and had to turn away. This was what his son needed. Not a perfect environment or the best specialists or unlimited money. His son needed to feel like his life mattered, like he had something to contribute, like he could do things that were worth doing. Marcus realized that in all his focus on fixing David's blindness, he had missed the point entirely. His son wasn't broken. His son was a complete person who happened to be blind. And that person had value and potential and dreams that had nothing to do with his ability to see. Marcus also realized something else. Without Simone's discovery, without her courage and determination, David would have spent the rest of his life getting progressively worse, not just physically, but mentally and emotionally. The darkness of being trapped in both blindness and deafness, combined with the psychological torture Victoria was inflicting, would have destroyed him. Simone had literally saved his son's life, not just from the poison, but from the despair that would have followed. Marcus made another decision that day. He was going to step back from his daily involvement at the pharmaceutical company. He was going to hire a new CEO to run day-to-day operations. He was going to restructure his life so that his son was no longer something he managed around his work schedule. His son was going to be his priority. Everything else was secondary. His assistants thought he was having a breakdown. His board members were concerned about his ability to lead. His competitors were probably celebrating, thinking he was going soft, that his attention was wavering. Marcus didn't care. He had almost lost his son to deliberate harm because he was too busy building an empire. He wasn't going to make that mistake again. He called a special board meeting and announced his decision to step back. The room fell silent. No one spoke. Then the CEO of the company, a man named Richard who had worked with Marcus for 20 years, stood up. Richard said that Marcus was making the right decision, that Marcus had built something great, but that something greater existed outside these walls, that his son was more important than any business, that everyone in the room had a responsibility to support Marcus in this decision, because he was doing the right thing. The board voted unanimously to accept Marcus's restructuring. More importantly, they voted to grant him emeritus status, which meant he could step back while maintaining his stake in the company and his board seat. He wasn't abandoning his empire. He was just choosing to live a different life. The changes happened quickly after that. Marcus converted one of the unused bedrooms into a shared space where he and David could spend time together. He set up a music studio because David had always loved music, and now with his hearing being restored, he could really engage with it. He created a game room where they could play together. He basically turned the penthouse into a home instead of just a showpiece apartment. Simone continued as David's caregiver, but she became something more than that. She became part of their family. Her daughter, Zara, started coming to the apartment after school, and soon the penthouse was filled with the sounds of children laughing, playing, learning. It was chaotic and messy, and nothing like it had been before. It was perfect. The trial date was set for 2 months away. Victoria's defense team argued that she was mentally unstable, that she had been driven to madness by her father's death, that she needed treatment rather than punishment. The prosecution, however, had overwhelming evidence. The poison bottles, the audio recordings, the pattern of David's deterioration perfectly aligned with Victoria's visits. The case seemed clear-cut, but Marcus knew better than to assume anything was certain. He had spent decades in courtrooms and boardrooms. He understood how power worked. He understood that wealthy, connected people sometimes received lighter sentences than they deserved. Victoria's family was wealthy. Her lawyers were the best money could buy. There was a possibility that she might negotiate a plea deal, that she might serve minimal time. The thought infuriated Marcus. His son had been deliberately poisoned for months. He had nearly been left in permanent darkness and silence. And Victoria might walk free in a few years. Marcus considered hiring someone to ensure that justice was truly served. He had the resources to make certain Victoria spent decades in prison. He had the connections to destroy her life completely, just as she had tried to destroy his son's life. But then he thought about what Simone had done. She had discovered the truth through careful observation and compassion. She had acted out of love for David, not out of revenge. She had chosen the hard path, the right path, even though it was dangerous. Marcus realized that following the same dark impulses that had driven Victoria would mean he had learned nothing from this experience. He decided to let the legal system handle it. He would cooperate fully with the prosecution. He would make sure all evidence was properly presented, but he wouldn't seek extra legal revenge. That would make him no better than Victoria. What he would do instead was something more meaningful. He would use his platform and his resources to ensure that this never happened to another child. He established the David Ashford Foundation for Child Safety. The foundation's mission was to investigate cases where children had been poisoned or harmed deliberately. It would provide legal resources, medical expertise, and financial support to families who couldn't otherwise afford to fight for justice. It would work with schools, hospitals, and caregiving institutions to develop better screening processes and safety protocols. It would ensure that people like Victoria, people who wanted to hurt children, couldn't easily access them. The foundation launched with significant media attention. Marcus gave interviews explaining why he had created it. He talked about his own blindness to his son's suffering. He talked about Simone's heroic actions. He talked about how systems failed to protect vulnerable children every day. He talked about the need for society to do better. The response was overwhelming. Donations poured in from across the country. Parents who had lost children to deliberate harm reached out, asking if the foundation could help them. Doctors and specialists volunteered their time. Lawyers offered pro bono services. Within weeks, the David Ashford Foundation had the resources and expertise to take on multiple cases simultaneously. But the most important work, as far as Marcus was concerned, was what was happening in his own home. David's hearing had been largely restored through specialized treatment. The boy could now hear almost everything he had heard before the poisoning began. The doctor said that with continued therapy, his hearing might return to completely normal levels. More importantly, David's confidence had been restored. He no longer seemed afraid or broken. He seemed like a normal, healthy child who happened to be blind. His podcast idea had actually come to fruition. Simone had helped him set up the recording equipment, and David had begun recording episodes where he talked about his life, his experiences, his thoughts about being blind in a sighted world. The podcast was simple, unpolished, sometimes rambling and unfocused. It was also honest and moving and genuine in ways that most professional media never achieved. Kids were listening. Parents were listening. Teachers were listening. David was reaching people through his authentic voice, through his willingness to share his experience without trying to inspire or educate in some forced way. He was just being himself, and that was more powerful than anything else. One evening, about 6 weeks after Victoria's arrest, Marcus was working late in his office when Simone knocked on the door. She asked if they could talk. Marcus gestured for her to sit down. Simone seemed nervous, like she was about to say something difficult. She began by telling Marcus about her daughter, Zara. She explained that Zara's condition was improving significantly thanks to the medical care and therapy that Marcus had arranged. She said that Zara was now attending a specialized school where she was learning and growing in ways that would have been impossible without Marcus's help. She said that she was grateful, deeply grateful, but also that she needed to be honest about something. Simone took a breath and continued. She said that she had discovered something else while investigating Victoria. She had found documents in Victoria's apartment that suggested the poison was not just a product Victoria had obtained on her own. The documents indicated that the poison had been ordered through a pharmaceutical supplier, the same pharmaceutical supplier that Marcus's company used. Someone inside Ashford Pharmaceuticals had provided the poison to Victoria. Marcus felt the room spin. What Simone was saying was impossible. One of his own employees had deliberately helped someone poison a child. Marcus demanded to know everything. Simone showed him the documents. They were printed emails, correspondence between Victoria and someone with an internal company email address. The emails discussed obtaining the poison, the pricing, the delivery methods. The sender's email address was generic, just a series of numbers and letters. No name. No identifying information beyond the email handle. Simone had already tried to trace the email, but whoever had sent it had covered their tracks well. It could take weeks or months for the authorities to figure out who it was. Marcus immediately called the federal authorities and turned over the documents. He informed them that there was an internal security breach at his company, that someone on his staff had potentially committed a serious crime. He gave them complete access to his company's servers and communication systems. Within days, federal investigators were swarming Ashford Pharmaceuticals. They were interviewing employees, examining records, tracing digital footprints. The company's stock price began to fluctuate as rumors spread about the investigation. Market analysts speculated about whether Marcus's company had been deliberately producing or distributing poisons. Some wondered if the entire company was involved in illegal activities. Marcus held a press conference to address the speculation. He explained that the investigation was internal, that his company was cooperating fully, and that anyone found to have participated in harmful activities would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. He also announced that he was bringing in an independent forensic auditing firm to examine the company's practices and procedures. He was determined to restore faith in the company and, more importantly, to ensure that no such breach could happen again. The investigation took 3 weeks. When the authorities finally identified the person responsible, the revelation shocked everyone. It was Dr. Robert Chen, one of the senior researchers at the company. He had been working on a pharmaceutical compound for years that had never been approved by the FDA. The compound had significant side effects, including hearing loss and other neurological damage. Dr. Chen had been trying to sell the compound illegally to black market buyers in Asia and Eastern Europe. When Victoria had approached him asking for poison, he had seen an opportunity to test the compound on a real person. He had offered to provide the poison at a reduced rate in exchange for detailed information about the effects. He was essentially using David as a test subject for an illegal drug. Marcus felt sick when he learned this. He had hired Dr. Chen. He had authorized his research. He had created the environment where this had been possible. More importantly, he realized that if Simone hadn't discovered the poison, if she hadn't investigated thoroughly, Dr. Chen might still be trying to sell this compound to other people. There could be children in other countries being poisoned with his company's products, and Marcus would have never known. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His quest for profit, his focus on growth and expansion, had created the conditions where evil could flourish. He had been so busy building his empire that he hadn't paid attention to what was being built in his company's laboratories. Dr. Chen was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, illegal drug development, and a dozen other federal crimes. He was facing decades in prison. The FDA launched a full investigation of Ashford Pharmaceuticals' research division. Several other compounds were found to have serious safety issues that hadn't been properly reported. The company faced massive fines and regulatory restrictions. Marcus's stock holdings lost significant value. Analysts began questioning whether he could survive the scandal. The business world waited to see if Marcus Ashford would fight back, if he would spin the narrative, if he would use his power and connections to minimize the damage. But Marcus had changed. He issued a statement accepting full responsibility for the failures in his company. He said that as CEO, the buck stopped with him, that he had prioritized profit over safety, that he had failed to properly oversee his research division, that he was deeply sorry for the harm that had resulted from his negligence. He announced that he would be implementing sweeping reforms at the company. He would be replacing the entire research division leadership. He would be implementing independent safety oversight. He would be committing a percentage of all future profits to child safety initiatives. He would also be stepping back from his day-to-day involvement at the company, delegating operations to a team he trusted, while maintaining oversight to ensure that nothing like this could happen again. The business community was stunned. CEOs didn't usually apologize this completely. They usually fought back, deflected blame, minimized responsibility. But Marcus had learned something from his son's experience. He had learned that pride was a luxury he couldn't afford, that admitting mistakes was sometimes more powerful than winning at all costs. The market actually responded positively to his honesty. Investors appreciated his commitment to genuine reform. Customers appreciated that he was taking responsibility. Employees appreciated that their CEO was willing to acknowledge systemic failures. Ashford Pharmaceuticals didn't just survive the scandal. It emerged from it with a stronger reputation than it had before. 1 year after Victoria's arrest and Dr. Chen's conviction, the penthouse in Manhattan had been transformed into something beautiful. The cold, sterile spaces had become warm and lived in. There were photographs on the walls now, pictures of David and Zara playing together, Marcus and Simone smiling at a foundation event, the four of them laughing at something Marcus had said. The apartment felt like a home instead of a museum. David's hearing had been almost completely restored through intensive therapy. The specialist said that any remaining hearing loss was minimal and would continue to improve with time. More importantly, David showed no signs of the psychological damage that Victoria's abuse and Dr. Chen's poisoning had intended to cause. He was resilient, curious, and growing into a thoughtful young man. His podcast had grown significantly. What had started as a simple project with Simone had become something bigger. He now had thousands of listeners. People wrote to him constantly, sharing their own experiences, asking for advice, expressing gratitude for his honest perspective on blindness. Universities had invited him to speak. Nonprofits asked if they could feature his podcast on their websites. David, at 12 years old, was becoming a voice for disabled children everywhere. He handled the attention with remarkable grace. He never let it go to his head. He remained focused on what he cared about, which was connecting with other kids who felt isolated or different. He used his platform to normalize disability, to challenge stereotypes, and to inspire others to see past physical differences to the person underneath. Zara had made tremendous progress as well. With the help of advanced physical therapy and specialized equipment that Marcus had provided, she was now able to walk short distances with a walker. She attended the same specialized school as David, where they had become best friends. They played together, learned together, created art projects together. Watching them, Simone and Marcus realized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Two kids who could have been isolated by their disabilities had instead become each other's greatest support system. They lifted each other up in ways that no therapist or specialist could have engineered. Their friendship was genuine and deep, built on mutual understanding and acceptance. The David Ashford Foundation had grown into a significant force in child protection. It had helped investigate over 100 cases where children had been deliberately harmed. It had provided legal resources to families who couldn't afford them. It had worked with schools and hospitals to implement new safety protocols. It had trained thousands of professionals in recognizing the signs of deliberate harm to children. The foundation had also quietly helped several other children recover from poisoning and abuse similar to what David had experienced. In each case, the foundation's experts had helped identify the perpetrators, gather evidence, and support the families through the legal process. Lives had been saved because of the Foundation's work. Victoria's trial had concluded 3 months after her arrest. She had been convicted on multiple counts, including attempted murder, conspiracy, and psychological abuse. The judge had sentenced her to 25 years in prison. It was a significant sentence, but it reflected the severity of her crimes. During her trial testimony, Victoria had actually expressed remorse for what she had done. She talked about the pain of losing her father, and how that pain had twisted into something dark and destructive. She acknowledged that David was an innocent child, and that her actions were indefensible. None of it changed her sentence. But it did provide some closure to Marcus and David. They understood that Victoria's actions had come from a place of broken grief, even if that didn't excuse what she had done. Dr. Robert Chen's trial had been harsher. He showed no remorse whatsoever. He argued that his research was valid, that testing compounds on children was necessary for medical advancement, that profit was the only thing that mattered. He was convicted and sentenced to 40 years in prison. Multiple federal agencies were now investigating other researchers and pharmaceutical companies to see if similar illegal testing had been conducted elsewhere. The work that Simone's discovery had initiated had far-reaching consequences. Dozens of unethical practices in the pharmaceutical industry were exposed and shut down. New regulations were implemented to ensure that research compounds were properly tested before being used. Child protection laws were strengthened. The system that had allowed Dr. Chen and Victoria to operate was dismantled and rebuilt with ethics and safety as the foundation. But the most profound change was personal. Marcus and Simone had fallen in love. It happened gradually, without either of them planning it. It started with small moments, conversations over dinner, shared concern for David and Zara, the simple act of being present with each other through difficulty and triumph. Somewhere along the way, it had become something deeper. Marcus realized that he loved Simone's quiet strength, her unwavering commitment to doing what was right, her ability to see people clearly and treat them with dignity. Simone realized that she loved Marcus's capacity to change, his willingness to admit mistakes, his dedication to his son, and the way he had opened his home and his heart to her and Zara without hesitation. One evening, about 14 months after Simone had first discovered the poison behind the radiator, Marcus took Simone to the rooftop of the penthouse. The sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The city stretched out beneath them, millions of people going about their lives, unaware of the miracle that had occurred in one small corner of Manhattan. Marcus had planned this moment carefully. He pulled out a ring, a simple, elegant diamond that had belonged to his mother. He got down on one knee and asked Simone to marry him. Simone said yes through tears of joy. She had never expected her life to turn out this way. She had come to the penthouse as a housekeeper, desperate to escape her past and provide for her daughter. She had found a family instead. She had found purpose. She had found love. The wedding took place 6 months later, in a small, intimate ceremony with just close friends and family. David was Marcus's best man. Zara was the flower girl. The wedding was held in the rooftop garden that Marcus had created on top of the penthouse. It was a beautiful space filled with flowers and plants, a sanctuary high above the city. David's podcast audience was invited to listen to a live broadcast of the ceremony. Thousands of people tuned in to hear David's father marry the woman who had saved his life. The comments poured in, people expressing joy, celebrating love, sharing their own stories of unexpected happiness. The ceremony itself was simple and profound. Marcus and Simone exchanged vows that they had written themselves. Marcus spoke about his blindness to what mattered most in life, about how Simone had opened his eyes to what truly mattered. He promised to spend the rest of his life making sure that David and Zara knew they were loved and valued. Simone spoke about courage, about standing up for what was right even when it was dangerous, about the grace that comes from allowing yourself to be changed by love. She promised to support Marcus and David and to help them navigate the world together. When they kissed, the crowd erupted in applause. David laughed and wiped away tears. Zara clapped her hands excitedly. It was perfect. The months that followed were filled with the ordinary magic of building a life together. Marcus and Simone worked together to create a home that was welcoming and warm, but also maintained the specific accommodations that David and Zara needed. They set up a proper studio for David's podcast so that he could record with professional quality equipment. They created a therapy space for Zara, where she could continue her physical recovery with the specialized therapist they had hired. They established routines that worked for everyone, that gave structure, but also allowed for spontaneity and joy. David continued to thrive in school. His teachers noted that he was one of the most engaged students in the class. He participated actively, asked thoughtful questions, and seemed genuinely interested in learning. His math skills were exceptional. His writing was powerful. He had discovered a love for literature and spent hours reading Braille books, particularly science fiction and fantasy. He had also become interested in music production, inspired by a guest on his podcast who was a blind musician. Marcus had arranged for David to take lessons with a professional music producer, and David was rapidly developing real skill. Zara's progress was equally remarkable. The physical therapy had strengthened her muscles significantly. She could now walk longer distances with her walker. She was developing independence in ways that had seemed impossible just a year earlier. She was also becoming quite the artist. The walls of the penthouse were gradually being covered with her drawings and paintings. She had a unique perspective, drawing the world from her own point of view, and her work had a freshness and honesty that was striking. Both children were thriving academically and emotionally. They were secure in the knowledge that they were loved and supported. They understood that their disabilities didn't define them or limit their potential. They had each other, and they had the adults in their lives who believed in them. The foundation continued its important work. Marcus had brought in a board of directors to oversee it, but he remained deeply involved in its mission. He visited families who had reached out for help. He testified before Congress about the need for stronger child protection laws. He worked with medical schools to ensure that ethics was being properly taught to the next generation of doctors. He was no longer the cold CEO focused solely on profit. He had become an advocate for change, and his position of power and influence was being used for good. One of the Foundation's most significant projects was creating a database of warning signs that could help identify when a child was being deliberately harmed. Teachers, doctors, nurses, therapists, and other professionals who worked with children were trained to recognize these signs. The database included information about various poisons and toxins that could be used to harm children, making it easier for professionals to identify them. This work had already led to the discovery of several other cases where children were being deliberately poisoned. In each instance, the Foundation's resources and expertise had helped identify the perpetrator and support the victim's recovery. 2 years after the poison had been discovered, David was invited to speak at a major medical conference. The conference was focused on ethics in pharmaceutical research and child protection. David, now 14 years old, stood before an auditorium full of doctors, researchers, and medical professionals. He spoke about his experience with being poisoned, about the fear and confusion he had felt, about the people who had helped him recover. He talked about what it meant to be a child who had been used as a test subject without consent. He talked about the importance of treating all patients, especially children, with respect and dignity. He talked about the responsibility that came with the power to affect people's lives through medical research and treatment. The speech was powerful and moving. Many people in the audience were crying by the end. David received a standing ovation. The Foundation received dozens of inquiries from researchers who wanted to partner with it on new safety initiatives. Medical schools asked if they could include David's story in their ethics curriculum. It was a moment where David's experience, as painful as it had been, became a force for positive change. Marcus and Simone watched from the front row, so proud of the young man David was becoming. After the speech, they took David and Zara out to dinner at his favorite restaurant. They celebrated his accomplishment, his courage, and his growing impact on the world. David was modest about it. He said that he was just sharing his story, that the real heroes were Simone for discovering what was happening and Marcus for taking action to stop it. But Marcus corrected him gently. He said that David was a hero too, because he was choosing to use his pain to help other people. He was taking something terrible that had happened to him and transforming it into something meaningful. That was the definition of heroism. By the 3rd year after David's poisoning had been discovered and stopped, the family had settled into a new rhythm. Marcus had completely stepped back from day-to-day involvement with Ashford Pharmaceuticals. The company was now run by a team of executives who shared his commitment to ethics and safety. The company's profits had actually increased because consumers and investors appreciated its ethical practices. What had seemed like a business liability turned out to be a business advantage. People wanted to support companies that prioritized integrity. Marcus spent most of his time on the foundation, but he also made sure to be present for his family. He attended David's school events. He helped Zara practice her physical therapy exercises. He and Simone took the kids on vacations, to the beach, to museums, to concerts. They were building memories, building a real life together. David's podcast had grown into something even bigger than anyone had imagined. He had been invited to be a guest on major radio shows and television programs. He had been interviewed by national newspapers. His story had inspired a documentary filmmaker to create a film about his journey. The documentary had premiered at a film festival and had received critical acclaim. It told the story of David's poisoning, his recovery, and his advocacy work. It featured interviews with Simone, Marcus, the doctors who had treated David, and other children who had been helped by the foundation. It also featured Victoria and Dr. Chen, and their explanations of why they had committed their crimes. Watching the documentary, audiences gained insight into the complexity of evil, the possibility of redemption, and the power of love and advocacy to create change. The film was picked up by a major streaming service and made available to millions of people worldwide. It sparked conversations about child safety, pharmaceutical ethics, disability representation, and the importance of speaking up when you notice something wrong. Teachers used it in classrooms. Medical schools showed it to students. Child protection agencies screened it for their staff. The impact was far-reaching and significant. David was invited to do a TED Talk. He stood on stage and told his story to a live audience and millions of people watching online. He talked about his childhood, about discovering he was blind, about the shock of losing his hearing, about the moment everything changed when adults finally paid attention to what was happening to him. He talked about Simone's bravery in investigating, about Marcus's willingness to change, about the importance of creating systems where children's voices are heard and taken seriously. He talked about his own role in advocating for change and helping other children. His TED Talk was viewed by over 5 million people in the first month. It became one of the most shared TED Talks of the year. Invitations poured in for David to speak at schools, conferences, nonprofits, and universities. He carefully chose which invitations to accept, always prioritizing his education and his mental health. He was still a teenager after all, and he deserved to have a normal childhood, despite his extraordinary circumstances. The foundation had now expanded to multiple locations across the country. It had satellite offices in 10 major cities. It employed over 100 staff members, including doctors, lawyers, social workers, and investigators. It had a budget of $50 million per year, provided by Marcus's endowment, donations from supporters, and grants from foundations that shared its mission. The work was expanding into international space as well, partnering with organizations in other countries to help protect children from deliberate harm. 5 years after David's poisoning had been discovered, Marcus and Simone decided to have a child together. Simone became pregnant, and the following year, their daughter, Hope, was born. She was a beautiful, healthy baby with her father's features and her mother's spirit. David and Zara were thrilled to have a baby sister. They helped care for her, changed her diapers, read to her, played with her. The addition of Hope to the family made it feel complete in a way that even Marcus hadn't anticipated. Holding his newborn daughter, Marcus thought about the journey he had traveled. 5 years ago, he had been a cold, distant CEO focused on building an empire. His son had been poisoned, his hearing destroyed, his future uncertain. Everything had seemed dark and hopeless. But then Simone had discovered the truth. Then she had risked everything to expose the crime. Then Marcus had finally learned what mattered. Now, standing in the hospital room with his wife asleep beside him, his 2 older children sleeping in the chairs, his newborn daughter in his arms, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Complete, full peace. His life had been forever changed by tragedy, but that tragedy had opened a door to something better than he ever could have imagined. The penthouse that had once been cold and sterile was now filled with the sounds of children laughing, the warmth of a family that loved each other, the purpose that came from doing meaningful work. David graduated from high school at 16 years old. He was valedictorian of his class. His speech centered on the theme of perspective, on how being blind had given him a unique way of understanding the world, and how everyone had gifts and insights that came from their particular way of experiencing life. He talked about the importance of diversity and inclusion, not just because it was the right thing to do, but because it made communities stronger and more interesting. He talked about the people who had helped him, about Simone and Marcus, about teachers and doctors and friends. He talked about his sister Zara, who had faced her own challenges and overcome them with courage and determination. The audience was on their feet before he even finished his speech. His words had touched something deep in people, a recognition that perspective and pain and overcoming adversity could teach us things that success and ease never could. After graduation, David had multiple college options. Several Ivy League schools had recruited him, offering full scholarships and special accommodations for his blindness. But David chose to attend a smaller, disability-inclusive university that focused on creating truly accessible learning environments for all students. He wanted to study human rights and advocacy, with a minor in music production. He wanted to continue the work of helping other people who had experienced harm and marginalization. His path was clear, and he walked it with determination and purpose. Zara continued to make remarkable progress. By the time she was 12, she was walking without any assistance, though she still used a walker for longer distances if she wanted to. The cerebral palsy would never fully go away, but it no longer defined or limited her life in the way it once had. She was a talented artist and a thoughtful student. She had dreams of becoming an architect, of designing buildings and spaces that were beautiful and accessible for people of all abilities. The family had expanded to fill the penthouse. It was no longer an empty, sterile space, but a living, breathing home. There were drawings on the walls, books overflowing from shelves, photographs documenting years of happy moments. There was laughter and conversation and the simple, ordinary magic of a family that loved each other. Marcus and Simone had built something extraordinary together, not just in terms of the foundation's impact or David's success, but in terms of the life they had created as a family. They had taken tragedy and transformed it into meaning. They had taken pain and turned it into compassion. They had taken a moment of darkness and found light on the other side. On a warm spring evening, 10 years after Simone had first discovered the poison behind the radiator, the family gathered on the rooftop garden to celebrate. It was the 10th anniversary of David's Discovery Day, the day that everything changed. They had invited close friends, including several staff members from the foundation, David's best friends from school, and Zara's friends as well. There was food, music, laughter, and celebration. David gave a speech where he reflected on the past 10 years. He talked about how a moment of crisis had become a catalyst for change. He talked about the importance of people who pay attention, people like Simone who noticed something was wrong and chose to investigate. He talked about people like Marcus who listened and took action. He talked about the millions of children around the world who were suffering in silence, whose cries went unheard, whose pain went unnoticed. He talked about the work that still needed to be done. He talked about his ongoing commitment to advocacy, to using his voice and his platform to speak for those who couldn't speak for themselves. He talked about his family, about the deep love and support that had made his recovery and his growth possible. And he talked about hope, about the possibility of healing, about the potential that existed in every human being regardless of their circumstances. When David finished his speech, there wasn't a dry eye on the rooftop. People came up to hug him, to thank him for his words, to share their own stories of overcoming adversity. Marcus and Simone watched their son, so proud of the man he was becoming. They had been given a second chance, all of them. They had been given the opportunity to build lives that mattered, to create change, to help others. They had been given love and family and purpose, and they were using all of it to make the world a better place. As the sun set over Manhattan, painting the sky in brilliant colors, the family stood together on their rooftop garden. Marcus had his arm around Simone. David was laughing with his friends. Zara was playing with Hope, helping her walk across the garden. They were together. They were safe. They were loved. and the darkness that had once threatened to consume them had been transformed into light. This was not just a happy ending. This was the beginning of a life well lived, a life full of meaning and purpose and love. This was the triumph of the human spirit, the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things, the possibility that exists in every moment to choose to be brave, to speak up, to act with integrity, to love fiercely and without reservation. The poison that had been meant to destroy had instead become the catalyst for healing, and that healing extended far beyond David and his family. It extended to hundreds of children who had been helped by the foundation. It extended to thousands of professionals who had been trained in recognizing abuse. It extended to millions of people who had been inspired by David's story and Simone's bravery and Marcus's willingness to change. One moment, one decision, one person choosing to pay attention and act on what they saw had rippled outward and changed the world in ways both large and small. And it had all started with a housekeeper cleaning a room, finding a bottle behind a radiator, and having the courage to investigate what it meant. That was the real story. That was the real power. That was the real happy ending.